Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. One of the biggest conversations going on in the province of Alberta right now is unquestionably around the Alberta Pension Plan project, projections, possibilities. I'm going with the alliteration again tonight. But there's been a whole lot of conversation in regards to what's being presented to Albertans, how it's being presented to Albertans, but even deeper than that, there's questions as to what exactly are we talking about here. So in order to make objective sense as to what exactly we're talking about when we're talking about the mechanics of an Alberta pension plan versus a Canadian pension plan, we're going to go to one of the most objective individuals in the field of economic commentary. He is mercilessly objective. That's one of the things that makes him such an amazing commentator and expert. So excited to welcome back to the show, Dr. Trevor Tombe. Dr. Tombe, thank you so much for joining us again tonight.
Great to be here, and thank you for the overly generous introduction there as well.
Oh, you see, but this is one of the things that I always enjoy about your commentary is that if there's a certain side that's like, oh no, but Dr. Tombe, we really want you to say this, your reaction is just like, no. And then you get right back to the data. So it's always very, you don't pick sides at all that I've seen. You pick your sides based on the data that's available and the actual information, as opposed to, but I really want you to cheer for this team, which I think is invaluable. So I don't think it's an overly generous introduction at all.
All right. Well, that's certainly how I try to approach things. And, me, like everyone, has personal biases, of course. And often, sometimes the data itself is unclear, and policies, as we get into, have some uncertainties around them. So, yeah, I try to genuinely reflect my impression of the data. And sometimes that's more precise than other times. But I think of it like, any professor ought to be thinking about how they engage as they would at the front of a classroom, where there's no bad questions, and we can go through and try to unpack what the issues are and explore things. Exploring things in public, I think, should be pretty similar to exploring them with students on campus.
Perfect. Well, given that you opened the door for me with no bad questions, and that you are in fact a numbers guy, just for the record, for clarity, I believe I have this correct, but I want to be sure. 300,000 is in fact a much bigger number than 2,500.
That's correct. I don't even need my calculator for that one. I'm just going to go out on a limb. Say yes.
Perfect. I just wanted to. There's been some confusion of late, so I wanted to put that one to rest.
Yeah. What's the context there on that question? 300,000 or?
Well, on Saturday, Danielle Smith said that the reason why they were doing telephone town halls is because they found the 300,000 in-person attendees to the town halls during the Fair Deal panel a little bit unmanageable, and a bunch of people went, "Wait, what?" And then she was like, "Oh no, I meant to say 2,500." 2 days later, after a bunch of people made some jokes, I don't know. So that was another joke.
I should follow things more closely.
It was one of those. It was actually a perfect storm, because she said the 300,000 on Saturday, and then we went to like, no, that's not right. There's no way that's right, because that's like 10 and a half saddle domes. And we went to look on the Fair Deal report, and it was unavailable on the government website for 2 days. It's back up now, so hooray for that. But it made for a fun little weekend. But we're here to talk about the Alberta Pension Plan Project. There's so many P words. But before we get into the
Lifeworks.
There we go. Report. I want to dial it back a little bit and talk about what exactly is the idea behind the CPP. I mean, one of the things that I think anybody who works for an employer will probably be able to testify as they look at their paychecks, their pay stub, if they even do that at the end of every pay period. And there's a little thing that says CPP, and then there's a dash, and then there's a number. What does that represent?
Great question. So you're right to note that every employee and self-employed individuals, with just a couple of exceptions, pays into the Canada Pension Plan. And similarly, workers in Quebec pay into the Quebec Pension Plan. And what this represents is a publicly delivered income guarantee to you when you retire that is tied to your earnings through your working life. And so it's one part of a broader system of supports that we provide to elderly Canadians. We have other programs as well, but the CPP is the one that's really tied to your earnings. And so what you're contributing is a certain fraction of your earnings. So we can get into a little bit more detail, but the core of the CPP, what's called the base CPP, the main benefit that has existed for many decades since the 1960s, you pay as an employee 4.95% of your earnings into the Canada Pension Plan, and your employer pays a similar amount also into the Canada Pension Plan. So you're each contributing to it in equal amounts up to a maximum. Okay, so your earnings increasing means you contribute more to the plan to a limit of about $66,000 this year. And then after that, you stop contributing. Okay, so there's a maximum amount. And then you do that through your working life. And upon retirement, then you collect benefits that are a function of your earnings through your life. And those contributions that you made while you were working is really meant to help finance the benefits that you will receive when you're older. But it's not the only source of financing for the CPP. So benefits to older Canadians are being paid out of the contributions that were made and investment returns, right? So we have a pretty big pot of money that is invested in a wide range of assets with the goal of generating income to help fund retirement benefits. And I guess that's it at a high level. You pay a certain amount up to a limit, and then when you retire, you collect benefits, and those benefits last until you die, which is kind of one nice feature of it. It has a little bit of insurance properties to it. You don't need to worry about running out, right? It just lasts as long as it needs to last.
Now, when we're talking, so $66,000 is the maximum a year that an employee and employer will contribute.
Or that's the max earnings, sorry. So you would contribute as an individual only up to about $3,750 or something per year. So at 66,000 is your earnings. That's when you max out your contributions. So it's 4.95% of that.
Oh, so it's 5% for those of us that are not so good at math of the 66,000. That's what you would contribute. Now, if let's say that I work Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 every day from I'm 14 till I'm the retirement age, which I don't know off the top of my head, probably should. But am I going to get more money than somebody who they work Tuesdays and they started when they were 35?
Yeah, great question. Absolutely. So the amount of benefits that you receive when you retire is tied to what you earned through your working life. Now, maybe the person who works just on Tuesday is lucky enough to earn $1,000 an hour, and so they're maxing out their earnings just with the one day of work, but unlikely. So yeah, the more you work, the higher your earnings are, the more benefits you will receive upon retirement. Now, there are provisions in the CPP to drop out low earnings years. So everyone can drop out some of their lower earnings years or a certain number of their low earnings years. There's also provision for things like having children and that sort of thing. So it's not penalizing you if your earnings happen to be low sometimes. So it's trying to capture roughly 85% of your earning years. So from 18 to, let's say, 65.
So I just want to recap to make sure I'm understanding all of this because I'm really not that bright. It is based on how much money every individual makes, is how much they pay, and how much they pay over their lifetime with some concessions is how much they get back.
Yeah, I mean, it's not at the individual level. So your contributions are not going into an account. You can't look up how much, some individualized account that's earning returns on the contributions that you've made. But your contributions that you make, they're a function of your earnings. And the benefits that you receive later on, those are also a function of your earnings. So higher income individuals will both contribute more, but also receive more later on. And so there's not a lot of redistribution going on between high and low income individuals. There is a little bit, just a little, because we have a 3,500 earnings exemption. So, I mean, if you're working part-time on some Tuesdays and not others, then maybe you're under the exemption and don't pay anything. So there's a little bit there, but there's not a lot of from high income to low income redistribution through CPP. The big redistribution across individuals is between who lives a long time and who does not.
Okay. The next question has to be then, I mean, we're talking about individuals, we're talking about employers. I keep hearing, though, that Alberta keeps paying more into the pensions. So how much does the province of Alberta contribute to the CPP?
Well, the province doesn't contribute anything. Individuals who live in Alberta do, and employers who are located in Alberta contribute. And that is an important distinction, because then you need to think about, well, do the type of individuals who live in Alberta differ from the type who live elsewhere? And for a pension plan, you naturally contribute while you are young and working. And then you collect benefits later on when you're retired and no longer working. And Alberta does have a younger population. So when you look in the data that StatCan puts together every year on where CPP revenues are coming from, right, where contributions are coming from, and where CPP expenditures are going, there is a gap between the amount contributed by Alberta residents and businesses and the amount paid to Alberta residents as retirement benefits. That's largely because of a couple of things. So the big one is that Alberta is a younger province than others. The average age here is about 3 years below what we see elsewhere. And so naturally, we'll have more individuals paying in because we'll have more individuals who are not yet retired than we see elsewhere. And the fraction of people who are over 65 is also much lower here than elsewhere. So that's one. And then second is the data doesn't keep track of where people move. Okay, so if you're an Albertan, you're working all your life, contributing to CPP while you were a worker here, but then retire to BC, Fernie, or Kimberley, or retire in Nova Scotia or something. The data is not going to pick that up as an Albertan who made contributions and then an Albertan who's receiving them. It'll be counted in the data as CPP payments to a British Columbian and a Nova Scotian. So the data is a little bit imperfect, but for the most part, that gap that we observe and that, you're right, is regularly referenced in this current conversation around an Alberta plan, that's really just driven by demographics, us being a young province. And then secondary factor is earnings are higher here. And as we noted earlier, higher earning individuals contribute more. But later on, those individuals are going to receive more. They just haven't yet received it, right? So in present value terms, over the life cycle of an individual, there's no redistribution across provinces. Someone in Alberta who is the same as someone in BC, earning the same, will live the same number of years, and so on, pay into and receive exactly the same amount from the CPP.
It almost seems like, especially when you said that last line there, it harkens back, if you will, to the conversation that we had around equalization, because it seems like there are some folks who are potentially misrepresenting the mechanics of the data in order to say, oh, Alberta pays more. I mean, there's an argument to be made that Albertans pay more into the federal coffers on average than somebody who's in one of the lower average income provinces, but that's because they're in a lower average income province. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this has a lot of similar flavors to the conversation that occurred during the equalization referendum now, I guess, 2+ years ago. And yeah, Alberta does pay more in, say, federal personal income taxes or federal corporate income taxes, but it's not because the tax rates are higher for Albertans. It's just that on average, people earn more, and highly profitable corporations locate here disproportionately relative to our population. So, one can agree or disagree with federal tax rates. One could want to see them higher or lower. That's fine. But it's not redistributing across provinces because of discriminatory treatment under the federal tax system. The personal income tax rate that you pay doesn't really depend on where you live, with some minor exceptions, like there's special credits for living in the territories, for example. But for the most part, it doesn't matter where you live.
I guess the next question has to be the argument for an Alberta pension plan has been going on for quite some time. I mean, the current website that the province of Alberta is using to advertise the idea was registered in 2013. So it's we paid a premium for that website address to be sure, as a province, but the idea has been around for quite some time. So what is your understanding of why people say, no, we should go it alone?
So it's a lot older than 2013. Back in the 1960s, when they were originally debating the Canada Pension Plan, so members of Parliament trying to set up the system to begin with, some members of Parliament at the time were speculating about what it would mean for Alberta to separate and set up its own plan. So people have been thinking about this as a generic idea for quite some time. And the reason is pretty simple. We talked about Alberta having a young population. And mechanically, that makes sustaining a pension plan easier, right? Because you contribute when you're young and collect when you're old. And so on the whole, a younger population has a few more years of contributions going on, and the benefits that are going to be paid out are pushed out into the future a little bit. So those contributions can earn some return for a couple of extra years relative to other jurisdictions. So a young population is going to have an advantage in operating and sustaining a public pension system. And that's a really fundamental advantage that Alberta has. And so when you crunch the numbers, and I guess we can talk about some of the details and uncertainties around that, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that a separate Alberta plan would have a lower contribution rate than the broader Canada Pension Plan. And so one would look at that and see it as, say, a payroll tax reduction. And that might motivate some to favor it because employees would pay less and employers would pay less. And this became a very salient issue in the 1990s because the reform that secured the future of the CPP, that basically ensures that for however long into the future you look, the CPP is sustainable. We did that by largely increasing contribution rates in the late 90s, ramping them up so that we could accumulate a big pot of investment dollars that would help sustain the plan. And at the time, that contribution rate increase did have some opponents. And that's really what brought the idea of an Alberta pension plan, really to the center of Alberta politics under Stockwell Day in 2000. And it was looked at and then ultimately dismissed then, but that idea has kind of lingered with us today. So I think the question is not this generic one around whether Alberta could potentially have an Alberta pension plan with a lower contribution rate. I think the question is how much lower and what are the risks that comes with? Because there's not just benefits here, there's also costs. And we need to compare the two to make a sensible decision around this.
Yeah, you kind of took my next question right out from underneath me there. So to clarify, before I get to the question part though, that contribution rate increase that guaranteed the security of the CPP, is that still in effect? Was it like a one-time thing, or was it like, we'll bump it and we'll keep it? What was the deal there?
Yeah, great question. So it was phased in over several years up to about 9.9% when you combine the employee and the employer, so 4.95% each. And I think that was fully phased in 2003 or 2004 or thereabouts. And it's been at that level ever since and is projected to not need to be any higher for the end of the century is kind of when we stop these projections. What we need actually to sustain the CPP is not 9.9, but 9.5. So the CPP is more than sustainable. So what they enacted, I guess, a quarter century ago now has been remarkably successful, and they've never needed to go back and adjust upward that contribution rate. If anything, in the coming years, we might start having a conversation about whether we adjust that rate downwards, because things have performed consistently year after year now better than we anticipated.
So, to be clear, that contribution rate secured the future of the CPP.
Mm-hmm.
A decrease of that contribution rate below that 9.5, I think you said, that would maybe cause some problems. But it seems like when we're talking about the possibility, because Alberta has a younger population, of maybe paying lower rates, that seems to be predicated on keeping that younger population. And if you don't and you decrease the rates, then you're trading off in security. Am I reading that right?
That's exactly right. So demographics is one of the most important factors here when thinking about where we're headed long run in a pension plan. So right now we're young, but each of us as individuals age as time goes on. And so to sustain a younger population does require migration flows. And young people tend to be those who move about. And so Alberta, looking ahead, if we were to no longer have the favorable positive net inflows interprovincially and internationally, then the pension advantage would shrink. And so some of my own estimates tries to get a sense of how big of a risk that is. And I find that positive net migration that Alberta currently has and currently enjoys, that's about 60% of the advantage that a separate Alberta plan would have. So if that positive net flow into the province were to cease, then what we would estimate a lower contribution rate to be, that would shrink by more than half. So it's not the whole ball game, and we can talk about what some of the other risks are, but demographics, very important. And if we think about where Quebec is today, it aged more quickly than the rest of the country. And in order to make up for that, they needed to increase their contribution rates. And now Quebec has nearly a 1 full percentage point higher contribution rate than the rest of the country because they aged more quickly. So it is a real risk. And you can't be sure where we're going to be decades from now. And that is important perspective. Right? We're talking about a pension plan that would need to be there for someone who, say, is graduating high school now. They're going to start collecting in the 2070s and 2080s. And many of them are going to live into the 22nd century. Like, we're talking about really, really long-term policy here. And so it's important to really consider these risks with a very hard head, I think.
Well, it worked out so well for Quebec, though. I mean, if they're paying a percentage point higher than the rest of the province. I'm curious. There has been a lot of speculation about and obviously speaking in broad terms, there's been a lot of speculation about the future of Alberta's economy. There's some people who are looking at things like oil and gas liabilities. There's some people who are looking at things like whether or not we're going to see oil and gas development drop off. It's all speculative. I want to be really clear about that. Best case scenario, we get to continue riding the boom and bust roller coaster that I know you're a big fan of for quite some time. Worst case scenario, though, if we do see a major shift away from oil and gas, it's conceivable, tell me if I'm wrong, please, that we would see some younger people go, oh, I don't want to be there anymore. It's very cold and there's no jobs.
Well, Calgary is a lovely city. Let me just start by saying that. I've lived in Vancouver and Toronto, and this is definitely my number one place to be. So I reject the premise of your question, I suppose. And it is important to remember Alberta's economy is more than just oil and gas. We're a very diversified economy with lots of strength in lots of areas. But you're right that historically, and we're even seeing it in real time right now, these net migration flows in and out of the province is really tightly correlated to oil prices. And we saw that in the last recession when oil prices fell in 2015 and 2016. we had negative net migration interprovincially from the province. And that's a real risk. Definitely a real risk. But I wouldn't hang my hat completely on, just talking about this long term as an oil and gas story, right? Alberta's a strong economy in lots of other areas as well. And were oil and gas to not be a part of the picture, then I don't think that would lead to Alberta being in a really difficult economic situation. It would mean that Alberta would look more like an average province with a normal economy. And now, that would mean some of the long-term pension advantage we would have would dissipate, like if our migration flows looked like Ontario's, right? Then some of the gap would shrink, but there would still be some advantage in the province, and some of that is some of that advantage is almost, I don't want to say baked in, but some of the risks are mitigated in that for the coming years, if we were to separate right now, then we would have contributions accumulating a fund that could then be used to cushion some of that future risk. But yeah, what if there's some future development and Alberta's economy starts to look more like a normal one, then some of the pension advantage would be eliminated.
Is Quebec a normal one?
Quebec's an older than average province with a below average amount of migration going on. Now, there's other barriers that Quebec faces. Language and cultural barriers slow down the pace of people moving in and out of that province. But they chose eyes wide open to have a separate plan, not for financial or economic reasons, right? They were motivated by other questions about historically, sovereignty has been a much bigger issue there than Alberta. And I should say that some in Alberta, the Western Canada Concept Party was the one who first ran an election on the idea of an Alberta pension plan, among other things, in 1982, and they're a separatist party. So if one really puts a lot of weight on provincial autonomy, then it's no longer an economic or financial issue. It's just one about principle. And I think that's one way to think about Quebec. It was on principle. It wasn't done as an economic or financial bet on the future.
It's interesting you say that, because I can't help but wonder if perhaps that principle should be a greater part of the conversation as for potential motivations for it, but that's speculative as well. I want to get into the report. So the Fair Deal panel, Jason Kenney gets elected, and he says, you know what, we're getting screwed so bad. We're gonna talk to Albertans to see how they feel about how we say they're getting screwed. And the equalization referendum came out of that, but also we saw the commissioning of the report for the Alberta Pension Project. Now, you've done some pretty in-depth analysis on the optimism, I'll say, that exists in that report. What are your big takeaways from the Lifework report that was just recently released and has been the impetus for this whole conversation that we're having?
So I think the most important thing to take away from the Lifeworks report is not that there's any issue that I take with the underlying calculations. I can actually interestingly replicate their results using assumptions that are used there. And in fairness to anyone who sits down and tries to estimate what a multi-decade projection for Alberta might look like, there's uncertainty. And sometimes the data is just not quite what we need. And so that's important to keep in mind when looking at any analysis of a long-term, of a policy of such a long-term nature. But what Lifeworks does is that I think really tilts the scales in favor of exaggerating the benefits of an Alberta pension plan is around how much of the CPP assets Alberta would receive when it withdraws. And that's critical. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just worker contributions that finance the pension system, it's also a pool of savings. And as you can imagine, the bigger that pool of savings is, the better, and the less that workers need to contribute. And so how much of the Canada Pension Plan investment boards, pot, we would get upon withdrawal is critical. Like, it is the single most important variable in this whole exercise. And unfortunately, the law that governs how those assets are divided between a withdrawing province and the rest is unclear. It's imprecise. It is not obvious what the Act requires, and there are multiple potential interpretations of the language in that Act. And unfortunately, if that weren't bad enough, those multiple interpretations lead to wildly different results in terms of how much Alberta would actually receive from the CPP. And so what Lifeworks does is they interpret the language of the Act as meaning that Alberta would be put back into the same position that we would probably be in if we never joined in the first place. And that's fine, that's intuitive, and one might think that that's fair, but it's not about fair or not. It's about what the words in the Act mean. And what I try and do in the paper that I put out, I guess 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago now, was to do a deeper dive into that section of the Canada Pension Plan Act, to really try and parse what the words mean in an historical context, right? When the Act was passed, what did they mean by the word derived, for example, which unfortunately is never defined anywhere in the Act. And so there's a lot of potential options, and I go through several, but what I think of as the reasonable range of how much of the CPP assets Alberta would receive wouldn't be the over half that Lifeworks supposes would be the case, but between 20 and 25%. Okay, so a larger share than our historical share of total contributions, to be sure. And that does provide an advantage to a separate plan in Alberta in addition to our favorable demographics. But that 53% share that Lifeworks supposes that Alberta would receive, putting aside the legal parsing of the language here, which certainly I'm not going to be the authority. This is going to involve the Supreme Court of Canada at some point if we actually go down this route. But just how do we think about reasonableness here? Well, the Lifeworks approach would pay out more assets than exist if Alberta plus Ontario were to withdraw. So just like two provinces, and then the formula would spit out more than exists in the CPP. And for some provinces, it would require a negative payment to them. So it just doesn't work in a practical sense for many scenarios that one would look at. And if we were to withdraw 53% of the assets, then this could also be pretty destabilizing to the system as a whole. So it's a kind of absurd outcome, I think, because the Act, we shouldn't read the Act as though those who passed it would want it interpreted in such a way that the whole thing would fall apart. So there's other ways.
Sorry, I was just going to say, would you characterize your estimate of 25% of the assets? Would you characterize that as being optimistic? Would you characterize that as being conservative?
No, I'd characterize 25. So if I read the language in the Act, and we don't need to go through it verbally here. It's be hard to do it verbally here, but I go through it in the paper in more detail and land on 25 as the most reasonable, in my opinion, interpretation of the Act lands on 25%, combined with the best available data that we have. But that, I think, is too high because the data that we use to come to that estimate is imperfect. Like I mentioned, the individual who, works in Alberta and then retires in British Columbia, right? We don't track in the data that individual's movements, right? So it's hard to know where benefits accruing to someone who previously paid in while they were in Alberta, where those are located. We just don't know. And there's some good reason in both the data and the census to the extent that it allows us to answer this question. Albertans who retire elsewhere, there's first a lot of them, and we just don't know how much that adds up to. And they're generally higher earning. So the CPP payments that are going to the retiree in BC is higher than someone who worked their whole life in BC and retires in Alberta, just because of the earnings differential. And so I, in my paper, consider this baseline estimate of 20% of CPP assets. Not because I have data that brings me from 25 to 20. The data doesn't exist publicly, and Lifeworks suffers from this same shortcoming as well. But I think it's just recognizing that migration works against the calculation for Alberta, not in favor.
I'm curious where the functional, I'm going to call it a functional tipping point, is for what's like, if we were to leave tomorrow and we were to get, let's go with like Lifeworks is 53%, presumably we'd be okay because we'd be walking with a whopping great stack of cash. Now, obviously that's unreasonable and not ever going to happen because you can't make something out of nothing. But conversely, if we left today and we said we're leaving, we're going our own way, and we got 0%, we would not have a functional model. So what's the magic percentage? What's the bare minimum that we need in order to have a functional model to take care of the number of people that we have right now? Do we have any idea what that number looks like?
Yeah, well, it's not about a certain amount that makes an Alberta pension plan viable or not. The question is, how much do workers need to contribute? And if there is fewer assets in a separate Alberta plan, then workers would contribute more than if there are a lot of assets in a separate Alberta plan. So for context, the amount in Lifeworks is well over $300 billion, and that would lead to they say about a 4-point drop in the contribution rate. Now, it's not quite that amount. It's about 3.6 percentage points drop there. If we go with what I think of as the reasonable scenario of 20%, then the contribution rate drop is about 1.3. And again, that's split between employees and employers. And so the savings in that scenario for a worker would be about $35 to $40 a month, just for context. If we were to leave and have zero assets, then the Alberta plan would need the contribution rate to be about 0.3% more than the Canada Pension Plan. And that would be between $5 and $10 a month or something extra. So it could be done. Like, even if there were no assets, it would be entirely feasible to set up a separate Alberta plan. And the contribution rate, while higher than Canada, would be lower than Quebec, for example. So assets matter a lot, but it's not about there being a magic number where it becomes completely infeasible or not.
Let me rephrase my question then. The sales pitch that we've seen on the Alberta Pension Plan, I mean, the whole premise is what's in it for you, which is, you know, if I was buying a used car, maybe would be a little bit more appropriate. But the sales pitch is, and it's heavily predicated on the use of words like could and should and maybe and unicorns. But it seems like the sales pitch is, if we do this, we could give seniors more money. We could knock so much off the premiums. We could give people a bonus payment when they retire, of like happy retirement. Here's your down payment on that new RV or whatever. That's the sales pitch. And it sounds like if we're closer to that 20% number, you know, we're talking about a 50% reduction in what those benefits could potentially look like. So I guess the question that I want to ask is, do you feel like the sales pitch that is being projected is an accurate one? And do you think it's representative of what the benefits could, because we're using that word a lot these days, actually look like?
So I don't think the sales pitch from the government of Alberta is accurate in the sense that it's not honest about the uncertainties. And it's not because I disagree with the calculation, given the assumptions. It's that everything is based on a single set of assumptions without recognizing that there's a lot of other potential future scenarios here that we should keep in mind. This is a very long run decision, and being aware of the pros and the cons is necessary. Being aware of what the uncertainties are is necessary. And one of the biggest uncertainties is the asset split, because the language is fundamentally unclear in the act itself. There's no obvious right way to interpret it. And because the outcomes hinge in such a massive way on what you assume going in, and the government has gone with a very rosy set of assumptions, and in my view, unreasonable in terms of the asset split, that's made the benefits come across very, very large. They say $1,400 a year for an employee, and another $1,400 a year for the employer if we were to separate. But we're not going to get 53% of the Canada Pension Plan fund, right? If we get something closer to 20, which is what I consider reasonable, although I'll be the first to tell you, there's uncertainty here. I'm not saying that 20% is the correct one. I just, for a lot of reasons, think it's more reasonable, but we should be aware of what happens if it's 15 or what happens if it's 25. The benefits shrink a lot. So if we go to 20%, well, now the benefits, instead of $1,400 a year, are $400 a year. So a big drop in those benefits. And if you want to pay seniors a little bit more in a separate Alberta plan, let's say we give them a 5% bump, just a little increase. Well, now the average worker's benefit is $300 per year. Okay, so those benefits, they're not zero, but they need to then be compared to risks. And we talked about the future demographic risks, the future migration risk. Who knows what's going to be the case in 2060, 2070, and so on. So these risks matter a lot. And then in addition, another risk we haven't talked about is investment returns. That's critical. And a broader CPP is a better diversifier and pooler of all of these risks. All right. A separate Alberta plan would be more exposed to mortality risk and migration risk and investment risk than the CPP is. And depending on how you model investment risk, and we don't need to go down the technical road here, then almost all of the Alberta pension plan's advantage could be eliminated, right? Because it depends on what future returns are, and future returns are uncertain. And then you layer on top of that concerns around whether a separate Alberta plan would use some of those savings to invest within Alberta, like the engagement panel is asking Albertans about whether or not they'd like to use the funds to invest in Alberta. That would lower the return as well. Right? If the goal is not maximizing returns, if it's that plus anything else, then you're lowering returns. And that's a risk as well. So there's some modest benefits there, but benefits that are not nearly as large as what the Alberta government is claiming. And those modest benefits need to be compared to the risks of a separate plan. And the government is not mentioning a thing about the risks. So it's not making this a coherent conversation around benefits and costs. And then reasonable people can evaluate and disagree about how they weigh one or the other. It's just putting in the window an exaggerated set of benefits and not talking at all about the costs. And that's really unfortunate.
It seems to me like, even just in this conversation, the security that exists in the CPP, to forego that is adding a level of risk that wouldn't exist by staying with the CPP, and to leave the CPP then adds the risk of the migration piece, which doesn't exist on the same scale. If at all. I mean, you could probably do the international migration.
Yeah, I mean, it exists in like the international migration sense, but the immigration flows for the country, that's a policy lever. We can make it go up and down by federal policy choices, but interprovincial migration, we can't control that. People will move where they want to move. And that's a risk that a separate Alberta plan faces that the CPP does not.
To go with the metaphor, the line that I've been saving up for this conversation is that I know that a theoretical physicist will say that if I slam my hand down on this desk, there is a not quite zero. There's a very small possibility that the molecules in my hand will align perfectly with the molecules in my desk, and it will phase right through. The desk won't break. My hand will be fine. There's a theoretical possibility of that. But if I was to spend the next, 5 years banging my hand into my desk, I can say with a fairly high level of confidence, I'm just going to have a really sore hand. And while there's a theoretical possibility that LifeMark speculation could happen, it's not that dissimilar. Am I reading it wrong?
Well, here, unlike particle physics, I guess the uncertainty is political. There is ambiguity in the language of the act, but the individual who interprets the act is the federal minister of finance. And so they will almost surely, it'd be hard to imagine a world where the federal minister of finance interprets the language of the act as the government of Alberta would like it to.
And screws over the rest of the country in the process.
Yeah, and I mean that it doesn't matter who is, what party is in power federally. They're going to interpret the language of the act from the perspective of, securing the future of the CPP. And I think there's a strong case to just read the words in an historical context to reach a conclusion that I find fairly reasonable. But after they make that evaluation, almost surely the Alberta government will challenge it or create a Supreme Court reference case. And so then it'll be up to the Supreme Court of Canada to parse the language of the act. So the number of things that would need to go, the number of things that would need to happen in order for the Lifeworks 53% estimate to actually occur would need to be that the federal government agrees, and well, I guess if they agree, then that's it. No, I take that back. Even if the federal government agrees, some other province is going to challenge it, right? So the federal government needs to agree, and then the Supreme Court needs to agree. And I think that's a zero probability event because the language is not something that implies what Lifeworks supposes that it does.
I did not have you saying I have better odds of phasing my hand through my desk than the Lifeworks model happening, but that I think really speaks to the...
Yeah, we'll save this clip, and I guess in 2030 when the Supreme Court rules on this, we can play it back and see if I'm right or not.
There we go. I know you're on a limited time and you've been very generous with your time, so I want to put as much of a bow on this huge topic as we can. What are the three, I got two questions. So what are the three things that you think the average Albertan should know about the proposition that the provincial government is putting forward?
Well, first keep in mind that old adage that if something appears too good to be true, it probably is. And I think that applies here, right? So reject anyone who's presenting just a black and white view of this, making it look like it is a slam dunk. It is a long-term, complex policy area that comes with pros and cons, and reasonable people can favor an Alberta pension plan or oppose an Alberta pension plan, but do so with a hard head, right? Evaluate the risks, think about the benefits, but not just the one rosy scenario that's put out there. Think about, what happens if we don't get 53% of the assets? What happens if it's more like 20? Think about lots of scenarios and then use that to reach a decision around how to evaluate the Alberta pension plan. So that's just the dollars and cents. And then second, think about the broader context, right? Alberta's relationship with other provinces or with the Federation more generally, like the act of separating because of the uncertainties, because of the enormous volume of financial resources that we're talking about and the security of individuals' income in their retirement years. Like these are very serious issues that we're talking about here, and it will be a messy process that will strain the Federation. And so that needs to be a part of the conversation too. So not just pure dollars and cents, but also, how should Alberta engage productively or not in a decentralized country like Canada? So keep that in mind as well. And then third, try and divorce politics from it as much as possible. A lot of people, I get the sense that, at least since 2015, a lot of the fairness in the Federation agenda, if you will, in Alberta is connected to partisan politics. And maybe I'll leave that for political observers to evaluate more. It just seems pretty obvious that it's a little bit about partisanship. And that's not new in Canada. Provinces fight with the feds all the time, and it's more intense when the parties are different. Okay, so that's not new. But try not to let your views about this policy that is on the table be swayed by partisan considerations, right? As I mentioned, this is a policy that needs to be there for anyone's child who's graduating high school now. It needs to be there for them for the end of the century and a little beyond, right? So this is some very serious stuff, and I think we need to take it seriously as well.
Okay. We are recording this on October 17th, just a couple of hours before you and I sat down to have this conversation. The Canada Pension Plan released its own little, hey, you're really not explaining this in an objective or fair way. And I think there's a lot of people who would certainly agree with that. I think that the bulk of this conversation speaks to that. Yes or no? I'll make it easy. Do you believe that the provincial government has provided Albertans with accurate information or complete information, or the amount of information that's required to make a decision of this magnitude?
So no question, the government has not provided complete information. It hasn't provided the right information that Albertans need to evaluate this choice. What it's presented is some information. And again, it's accurate as far as the calculations go from assumptions to results. But it's not what Albertans need to fairly decide this question. And then layer on top of that, the government is not really engaging with Albertans either. It's a large-scale marketing campaign to try and convince Albertans about the merits of an Alberta pension plan, but using, as we've talked about at length here, using very rosy projections in order to tilt the scales here. So I think that's, anyway, that's the choice they've made, and here we are. But it's really unfortunate. It could have been a conversation that if they wanted to have it, then present multiple scenarios, be open about uncertainties and risks. Also, be open about benefits and how big or small they might be, and then actually have a neutral engagement with Albertans to try and actually learn what their preferences are, rather than try and I'm hesitating to use the word mislead, but I can't come up with a better word than that, rather than mislead Albertans and try and convince them about the merits of a policy rather than actually engage with them.
Okay. I lied. I got one more. If you were to speculate, and it's purely speculation, and then I'll let you go, I promise. If you were to speculate, what is, like, I look at the equation as it's been presented, and as people much smarter than me have presented it, and I go, I don't see the upside. Why do you think it is? What's the motivation? Is there a mathematical motivation? Let me ask the question that way. Is there a mathematical motivation for the province of Alberta to lean this hard into this extremely zero possibility scenario?
There is. I mean, as I noted, what I think of as the most reasonable baseline scenario for an Alberta pension plan has a contribution rate that's 1.3 percentage points lower than the Canada Pension Plan. That's savings for an individual worker of a little more than $400 a year, plus savings for an employer of a little over $400 a year. So that's $800 a year for every single job in the province. That's not nothing. It's not $5 billion a year that's in the window. It's more like 1.5, but that's not nothing either. Now I look at that and then compare it to the risks, and then get a little, I hesitate there, but there are mechanically benefits that exist, and that's hard to avoid when you have a younger population, just mathematically. So there are benefits, and whether those benefits outweigh the costs is where reasonable people will differ. And so some individuals might not be all that risk averse. Individuals vary in their preferences for going to the casino, for example. So some are more risk loving than others, and that's fair enough. but we should just be aware that there are these risks, and the benefits are not so overwhelming that the risks are suddenly irrelevant.
Dr. Tombe, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat tonight. I feel confident that I'm going to be bugging you for additional conversations in the future. If the decision hasn't been made as to whether or not we're going to go to a referendum, if as some people, maybe the chairs of panels, are saying that the decision has been made, then we've got 2 years of this conversation, and I feel like it's going to evolve as we go. But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat tonight. And I like I said, it's the empirical objectivity that you bring to the table that I think is so important and valuable. So thank you for that, sir.
My pleasure. It's great to be here, and thanks for the conversation.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.